Tes, tes, tes.
Tes. Ini masih kebalik ya?
Ada ya, ada tulisannya apa?
Tulisannya kebalik.
Siapa yang rekor?
Tulisan itu bacanya kebalik.
Tes, 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 tes.
Sudah terdengar, Mbak
Sudah
Aulia, Mbak Rani.
Siapa? Saya sudah. Wow. Hah? Hah? Mik.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, Bapak. Good afternoon, selamat siang, Bapak dan Ibu sekalian. Sebentar lagi, dalam 1-2 menit, kita akan segera memulai sesi hari ini ya. Good afternoon, Bapak dan Ibu, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, colleagues, and also ladies and gentlemen joining us from Jakarta University and also Polytechnic across Indonesia. Also, welcome to our expert joining us from Germany, Professor Oliver Lah, and also Heinrich Weiss. Hopefully I pronounce your name correct. Selamat siang, Bapak dan Ibu sekalian. Welcome to today's session on the webinar of Transport Decarbonization, Unlocking Financing and Policy Pathways. So, my name is Aulia Shahrani or Rani. I am from KfW Development Bank in Jakarta office, and I will be as your moderator for today's session. So this webinar marks a very first activity under the series of knowledge sharing series on the decarbonization on the transport sector as a part of supporting initiative between KfW Office Jakarta and also Coordinating Ministry of Infrastructure and Regional Development or CMIRD. So this is also as the initial initiative under PBL Transit. So before we begin, please allow me to run through a few housekeeping rules for our today's webinar that shortly we will show you on the screen. So yeah, for today's session and also webinar, we have several webinar guidelines for you to follow to ensure that our event could run and go smoothly. First is to rename your username based on your name and also institution using the following format that you can see. Second one, to mute your microphone. Please kindly requested to keep your microphone mute and throughout the webinar unless invited by the moderator. Third is if you have your question during the session, please kindly put that on the Zoom chat, or you can also go to the YouTube live chat for Kemenko Infrastructure. For the YouTube channel. The committee at the end of the session, the committee will select 3 questions during each discussion session to be asked to the speaker. Fourth, please maintain your professional behavior and also respectful communication throughout the webinar. 5, that about the e-certificate, at the end of the webinar, a QR code and registration link will be displayed to obtain the certificate. So please make sure you're following today's session until at the end of the session. 6, for the attendance, please remain in the webinar until the closing session until 4 p.m. And also, if you have any experience regarding the technical issue, please contact the committee through the Zoom chat. The webinar may be recorded and will be available at the Kemenko Infra YouTube channel, and the presentation materials will also be shared during the event. So that's our few housekeeping rule for today session and the webinar. So without further ado, to officially open today webinar, please welcome Ibu Mainarti Fauzi, the Assistant Deputy for Sustainable Connectivity at Coordinating Ministry for Infrastructure and Regional Development for opening remarks. Ibu May, the screen is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Mbak Rani. Ya. Ibu Ana Christina Schimmer, Portfolio Manager KfW Office Jakarta, Professor Dr. Oliver Lah, and Mr. Heinrich Weiss, our distinguished experts. distinguished invitees, colleagues, participants, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all of you. Allow me, on behalf of Deputy Coordinating Minister for Infrastructure and Regional Development, Mr. Odo Manuhutu, to welcome you all to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion on transport decarbonization in Indonesia. Ladies and gentlemen, the transportation sector plays an important role in helping Indonesia achieve its climate goals. It accounts for around 22% of emissions from the energy sector, making it the third largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. This is why reducing emissions from transportation is one of our national priorities. The government of Indonesia has made transport decarbonization an integral part of its national development agenda as part of our commitment to achieving net zero emissions by 2060 or earlier. To support this commitment, our colleague from the Ministry of Transportation has completed the roadmap for transport decarbonization. The roadmap covers all major transport subsectors, land, rail, maritime, and aviation, and provides a clear direction for accelerating the transition to a low-carbon transport system. It also recognizes that strengthening human resources and institutional capacity is essential, as successful implementation of decarbonization depends not only on technology and investment, but also on skilled people and strong institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, today's webinar marks the beginning of the Expert Knowledge Sharing webinar series, organized jointly by the Coordinating Ministry for Infrastructure and Regional Development with KfW. This initiative will continue with executive teaching sessions in the coming months to further strengthen our capacity to advance transport decarbonization. The theme of today's webinar, Transport Decarbonization, Unlocking Financing and Policy Pathways, is both timely and relevant. We will learn from international experiences and best practices on topics such as avoid, shift, improve framework, financing and carbon pricing, greenhouse gas emissions accounting, and the policies and institutions needed to support low carbon transportation. I would like to express our sincere appreciation to KfW for this partnership. I also extend my gratitude to Professor Dr. Oliver Lah and Mr. Heinrich Weiss for sharing their knowledge and experience with us today. I hope this webinar will provide valuable insights, encourage meaningful discussion, and support Indonesia's effort to build a cleaner and more sustainable transport system. With that, I wish you all productive and engaging webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibu May, for your opening remarks and highlighting the push for the transport sector contribution toward Indonesia national GHG reduction goal. Next, we have to share the perspective of our key partner on this program and also on this agenda with the coordinating ministry. It is my pleasure to welcome Ibu Ana Skrimer, Senior Portfolio Manager at the KfW Office Jakarta, to deliver her opening remarks. Ibu Ana, the screen is yours.
Ya, thank you, Rani, and selamat siang, Bapak dan Ibu. Ibu Manat Fauzi, Assistant Deputy for Sustainable Connectivity of the Coordinating Ministry for Infrastructure and Regional Development, that is CMRRD. Our esteemed experts joining us today, Professor Oliver Lah and Mr. Heinrich Weiss, and of course, our distinguished colleagues from various ministries, agencies, and the government of Indonesia. Good afternoon to all distinguished participants of today's webinar. My name is Anna Schirmer, and I'm very much honored to speak here today on behalf of the German Development Bank, KfW, out of our office in Jakarta. KfW and the government of Indonesia share a long-standing and trustful partnership in the field of sustainable and urban development. Together and alongside with a very, very close collaboration with the European Union, KfW has been deeply committed to supporting the preparation, financing, and implementation of climate and environmental related projects, as well as important sector reforms. By doing this, our portfolio is very firmly anchored by Indonesia's national development strategies, and we align very much our efforts with the country's sector priorities, ranging from circular economy and solid waste management to infrastructure and urban development, mobility, to financial markets and economic integration. The government of Indonesia has rightly placed the low-carbon transportation transition as one of the 5 priorities in the RPGMN 2025 to 2029. This focus on transport decarbonization, cleaner energy, and climate-resilient infrastructure is a vision that KfW fully aligns with and supports. We, as an institution and jointly with the government of Indonesia, we have a robust pipeline in urban mobility projects that are currently underway or under preparation. And these include, as a highlight of our cooperation, the Surabaya Regional Railway Line that is currently in implementation of a first phase and a second phase that is under preparation. We further have successfully already deployed and implemented a sustainable urban mobility plan of the Greater Surabaya region. We have a pipeline project that is related to the BRT development in Greater Surabaya and Semarang that is under preparation. And currently, we are funding a scoping study that is on the electrification railway line Padalarang-Cicalengka and Cikarang-Cikampek. Furthermore, KfW's support goes beyond the physical infrastructure. We also partner with the Indonesian government through targeted policy-based lending programs. These programs are designed to accelerate environmental protection, drive decarbonization, and foster sustainable development. Our current strategic focus is the development of a new policy operation that specifically targets the mobility sector. It is called Transit. And Transit stands for Transforming the National System for Integrated and Sustainable Transport. With this, we aim to support the government of Indonesia in enacting policy reforms for sustainable transport and decarbonization. We are currently in an active preparation and dialogue phase with various ministries, working together with CMIRD as the executing agency, the Ministry of Finance, as well as the Ministry of Transportation, Bappenas, and the Ministry of Environment as potential implementing agency. These policy reforms will support subsequent policy actions required under the roadmap for decarbonization of the transportation sector. And our objective is to provide a strong policy umbrella for integrated and sustainable transport. As Ibu May previously highlighted, we are excited to collaborate with CMIRD on a series of knowledge-sharing events and executive teaching classes over next month. These initiatives are designed to reach a broader audience and significantly strengthen institutional capacity across sectors coordinated by CMIRD. So with that, I would like to thank you for this opportunity to collaborate. We look very much forward in continuing this highly strategic and valuable cooperation with CMIRD, both on this mobility and decarbonization roadmap and beyond. Terima kasih dan selamat siang.
Thank you so much. Terima kasih dan selamat siang, Ibu Ana. Thank you so much for your remarks on the continuation and cooperation between KfW Jakarta and also the government of Indonesia, especially with the coordinating ministry on the mobility and also transport sector. So, participant, we will move to the highlight of our session. And before that, I would like to remind you that please note and also chat your question during the session through the Zoom WhatsApp chat or the YouTube of Kemenko Infrastruktur dan IPK YouTube channel. So at the end of the session, the committee will choose 3 questions to be questioned to the professor. Without further ado, let's start into our first session. It is my absolute honor to introduce our first speaker, Professor Oliver Lah. As an introduction, Professor Oliver Lah is the professor at the Swedish School of Planning. Blaking Institute of Technology, and also the director of Urban Living Lab Center, a UN Habitat Collaborating Center. So, Prof. Oliver, you have 45 minutes for your session, and the screen is yours, please.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks to the coordinating ministry and to KfW for having us. It's great to see you all here. It's a great group. It's a very challenging topic that we're addressing. If you could allow also the sharing of the screen, then I can put up my slides. I'm quite excited to talk to you about decarbonizing transport. It's a key decarbonization sector, and a key critical issue that I keep mentioning all the time is that this goes well beyond climate change mitigation, but it really is about energy security, it's about resilience, it's about livable cities and safety and security and a human-centered focus in urban development. And this will be a recurring feature in my little discussion that I'll start with 3 presentations on our avoid, shift, improve approach, then the fiscal, non-fiscal incentives for transport, and then wrapping that part up with the policy and institutional mapping, because it's basically all intertwined. The interventions that we have, the policy and investments that we need, and who's basically responsible for it, at which level. And then my dear colleague Henry Weiss is following up on global decarbonization calculation standards, carbon financing mechanisms, and carbon pricing instruments. And that hopefully should give you a good package of ideas of things to take forward in your daily work on decarbonizing the sector and making it more sustainable, more resilient, and more human-centered. So we'll start with a little intro on avoid, shift, improve. It's a very old and a rather practical way of looking at sustainable mobility, where we say that we want to avoid all the unnecessary travel, that we can keep distances short, that we shift towards more efficient modes of transportation, and at the very last bit then basically electrify everything that is moving around that still needs a propulsion system. And from a carbon perspective, this goes along the key structural elements of transport, that we focus on the activity, the structure, so with which modes are we moving around, with the energy intensity, and with the fuel carbon that brings the whole package of the emissions that we need to break down on the transport sector. And the whole idea of the little package of presentations that I'm sharing with you is that there's basically no silver bullet in transportation. That is a bit different, let's say, in other sectors. If we look at the energy sector, so electricity sector, for example, you could go here fully for a technology shift. Not saying that this is easy, but it comes with a different angle. A much more centralized approach would be viable here. In transport, we have millions of users moving around in very different types of vehicles. So we need an integrated package. And here the beauty is, if we look well beyond climate, we can address so many issues with sustainable transport. We can improve air quality, safety, access, productivity, make our economies more resilient towards oil price shocks. And of course, that's a rather relevant element that we see every day. And of course, this needs a lot of actors, and we need to build coalitions around them. So we need to understand their objectives and need to address them in an integrated way. And the reason why we would like to do this is that we could not just rely on short-term interventions. We need long-term continuity for the transitions in our infrastructures, vehicle stock, and mobility services that is required for the whole transition of the sector. So transport is a key sector in transport decarbonization, in overall decarbonization, and we're still highly dependent on fossil fuels. But the economic gains that we can have throughout that transition are significant and pay well off the investments that we require in the transport sector. So the key bit is just basically bridging the gap between the time that when we need to invest and need to provide vehicles, infrastructures, and services, and the time that it pays off. So, on an annual basis, we're talking about anywhere between $5 and $7 trillion every year that we could save, which of course accumulate over the time that the investments in infrastructures and vehicles are being paid off. And, just one small example, the time that we spend in traffic accounts, depending on where you are. And Jakarta is, of course, a challenging example for heavy traffic, between 1 and 10% of GDP lost every year. So, just as a small example. So if we look at the overall decarbonization of the sector, it's critical to understand that, yes, sure, we could go right down to electrifying the entire sector and not doing anything else. So that would bring us almost full decarbonization, but then we're still stuck in traffic. We're still killing people on the road in road traffic crashes. And we're still not having provided access for everyone. So the whole idea is to bring avoid, shift, improve all together. And the way we would do this is through clever urban planning, that we create compact and mixed-use cities, build high-density corridors around transit and public transport, provide digital solutions that connect all the systems and allow people, for example, to work from home and not do unnecessary travels if there is no need to. Of course, in the freight sector as well, consolidating freight and distributing it more efficiently is a key element, in particular when there are competing companies doing similar routes. And then managing demand through parking and pricing and street price allocation is quite critical for the avoid pillar. That can bring us anywhere between 20 and 30% emission reductions. But just a small example on one of the things that helps addressing this pillar is on road pricing, and London is a good example that has made quite significant progress in that field, where the overall emission reduction can be partly linked to the road pricing and access to the city, which provides funding to invest into public transport and discourages the use of the private car. So when then shifting over to public transport, to walking and cycling, we of course need to be able to compete with the rather attractive mobility solution, the car. So here a provision of efficient, reliable public transport is a critical element of safe walking and cycling. Infrastructure is of course very critical. And of course here the intermodality kicks in, because obviously between walking, cycling and public transport you use at least two of them to move around. So there the interconnectivity needs to be quite close. And of course here also digital solutions can help to make that shift possible. Sharing opportunities of different types of last mile connectivity solutions is a critical element in that, so that we can compete with the car basically through efficient modes. And then of course that includes solutions like the Transjakarta bus rapid transit, for example, and other high quality, high capacity backbones of the public transport system, which then need to be complemented to create that network of mobility solutions that we need to be able to attract users towards that system. And of course, here the interplay between public transport and other shared mobility solutions, walking and cycling, is quite critical. And of course, then when we have densified public transport solutions, then of course electrifying those is a critical element, and that's what we do in projects like EBRT 2030, for example, which provides nice examples from cities around the world picking up bus rapid transit solutions and electrifying those in a efficient and effective way. The last pillar, so I would also always try to prioritize those three, that we first think about the cities that we live in and how they are structured and how people are moving around, and then the modes that they use, and then the last pillar, all the remaining vehicles, basically, that we need to electrify those. Of course, in the midterm, then there are also efficiency gains made through current technologies, but there is no way around electrifying the entire vehicle fleet. So here, of course, while they are the most expensive at the moment, the heavier vehicles, such as the buses and trucks, they are, of course, also providing the biggest gains, for example, with regard to air quality gains. And of course, here, usually, larger vehicle fleets are either publicly owned or publicly controlled or publicly regulated. So pushing towards the electrification of those vehicle fleets is quite viable. Of course, in the smaller scale, beyond the public transport side of things, we have quite economically viable solutions, but there is quite some dynamic in the bus sector at the moment with regard to electrification. And of course, here a key element is also that this provides a great opportunity for local manufacturers, or at least more local assembly of vehicles. So collaboration with international players could be quite a critical element also in the bus sector. But here, of course, there are some heavyweights in the market there already, in particular from China, who have quite competitive pricing, but it does provide an attractive opportunity to electrify the vehicle fleet, because in the overall life cycle of a bus, an electric bus is significantly more efficient and provides a great alternative to an internal combustion engine fueled vehicle. In projects like Solutions Plus, where we focus on electric mobility, in particular small and medium-sized vehicles, 2- and 3-wheelers, minibuses, vans, and we've worked on quite a range of vehicles. So here you see some cargo bikes from Quito and some minivans from Buenos Aires, where we worked with local entrepreneurs to develop those vehicles and produce a local market. And this, of course, in particular, this market segment is very viable for the push towards a domestic industry in this field. And what we've learned over the years working with local entrepreneurs is that interplay between international suppliers and local entrepreneurs can be a very viable combination to create economic opportunities. So while I do keep mentioning all the time the CO2 emission reductions that those solutions are creating, the economic opportunities of the gains that we can make through saving petrol, but also then through building a domestic industry and creating jobs in mobility services is such a critical element to push things forward across any political kind of spectrum. And that's what we've done, for example, in countries like Rwanda and Tanzania, where we worked with a women cooperative picking up electric motorcycles that are locally produced, providing a service that is directed from women by women to women, and of course providing a more safe and attractive mode of transportation, and at the same time doubling the income basically of the driver of that motorbike taxi. Similarly, in the three-wheeler field in Tanzania, where we work with a local company to develop and deploy electric three-wheelers, which of course creates also huge gains with regard to noise and air quality in the city, and having also a much more attractive and reliable last mile connectivity service. This, of course, goes along with a lot of supporting job opportunities around maintenance and services around those types of vehicles. So overall, and we'll also share, of course, those slides and the examples, and I'm looking forward to see hopefully many of you also at the in-person training in Indonesia. So we'll then be able to dive a bit deeper into some of the examples from Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and all the examples that we've developed in the field of bringing it all together, the entire spectrum of avoid, shift, and improve. And here the key point is the complexity of it, which makes it a bit of an annoying sector to decarbonize, because the silver bullet, as I said, is missing. But we need to basically shoot from the entirety of the spectrum. So when we bring together the plannings, the investments, the pricing, the regulations, and the operation, then we have across the avoid, shift, improve field the entirety, and you need all of the solutions basically to fit together. So we cannot just shift towards public transport if we don't plan our cities well, if we don't improve our vehicles and bring this together with urban planning where we are still stuck in traffic. So you see that it all fits nicely together, and that of course in the field of how we make this happen. Funding, of course, is a key bit, but it's not just about the money. It's just about the money at the right time, at the right place, basically. The institutional aspect is quite relevant. I'm going to get to that in a minute. And of course, building knowledge and capacity is a critical element. And this is where initiatives like the ones that are being organized here by the coordinating ministry and KfW are so helpful to share some knowledge with you and give you ideas on how to bring air quality, safety, access, productivity, jobs and skills, urban quality, and energy security all in one together. Because this also allows us to have key arguments when political winds are changing. We see this in other countries where topics like climate change are not so important anymore. And of course, here you need to be able to convince your minister or your mayor for solutions that are bringing us towards sustainability, but may not be on the political agenda when you look at climate change. But then, of course, when we work towards a completely sustainable transport system, we can address so many political issues that we'll always find a good reason to move forward. And this is where the whole coalition building and sustainability of the trajectory is so important. Obviously, there are many players involved in the field, and we'll get to that also when we do the mapping. But key bit when you look at the avoid, shift, improve approach, of course, is very clear, is that local, regional, and national level need to be working very closely together. The cities are the core of the avoid part, and of course, they are a key source of transport and emissions. And but of course, when we look at the national scale, this needs to fit together also in an intercity transport system. So this is where local and national governments need to be working together very closely. So when we look at the avoid, shift, improve impacts, we of course need to also be mindful of the way that we calculate emissions. And also this is something that my colleague Henry Weiss will pick up later on. But as you have in mind, the structural elements of the system, the activity, the structure, the intensity, and the fuels. You can connect this then quite nicely with the direct and indirect benefits that are being generated through the emission reductions, but then also what we call the co-benefits, which are more like synergies with other key policy areas. And then you have your overall evidence base that you need to come up with convincing policy advice. So focusing on corridors, integrating the physical infrastructure of existing, or in some cases, like in Indonesia, you also have new areas of cities that are being built, or even entire cities that are being built new. And of course, having in mind here this whole logic of bringing avoid, shift, improve together in an urban environment is quite relevant, of course. And then bringing together demand, the policy levers, the packages that we need is sort of critical to bring this all together. And what we need as a key takeaway is that we do need to be mindful of the hierarchy of the levels of intervention. We need to bring together the co-benefits, and we have so many practical examples from all three levers that we don't need to wait for any new technologies to come along. We have plenty of solutions on how to create compact cities and how to move to efficient public transport, and already a number of highly viable electric mobility solutions around that we can start now. And what we would need for this is, of course, also on the fiscal side of things. Of course, someone needs to pay for it. And here, of course, it's always quite important to not just think about the money that goes in, but also the money that we can generate and how we can use financial instruments to disincentivize car traffic and incentivize efficient transport modes. And when we look at the overall system, then of course, it's not a direct one-on-one. So if I use my car, I have my direct incentive to have, that more attractive or easy mode of transportation, let's say. So that the direct disbenefit to the society, for example, of the emissions that I emit, or the people that I may hit on my way to work or so, or the public space that I use is improperly balanced. So we need to rebalance those incentives among individuals and society a bit more. And this is where the whole collective action comes in, where we need financial mechanisms to bring solutions together. And here levels of intervention are quite important from a policy side of things, that we need to look at standards. So this goes in particular towards the vehicle standardization of the emissions, of the technologies, of the taxation that is then bringing users towards the purchase or not of different types of vehicles. So here a differentiation between less efficient and more efficient types of vehicles is quite important. In countries like Denmark, for example, you can pay up to 100% of the price of the vehicle as an extra purchase cost at the beginning of the lifetime, let's say, of the vehicle in your family. And here, of course, you have a great opportunity to steer consumers towards different types of vehicles. Whereas, for example, electric vehicles, small and efficient electric vehicles, may even attract less to zero taxation at the purchase. Or you have this on an annual basis, where you have a recurring tax annually that you pay for your vehicle. And of course, here you can also differentiate quite nicely among efficient and non-efficient types of vehicles. So this allows us to generate some funding. And here, of course, we can then reinvest this into infrastructure. And of course, this is where the national and local government level need to work together quite closely, because in many cases taxation is done at the national level, and then infrastructure investment is done in cities and urban areas, and of course there the money needs to flow basically to enable cities to invest efficiently. And when we bring the fiscal, the regulatory, the market-based, and the enabling and investment measures together and share information on all of this, then we have a package of policy instruments that is complete and brings together the push, the pull, and the enable elements of the spectrum. Because if we only push people out of the car and don't provide any alternative incentives, the political backlash can of course be very high. And as transport is such a prominent sector and such a politically savvy sector, it's very important to start pull before push. And when we look, for example, at fuel and carbon pricing, my colleague Henry will also touch on this in more detail on the carbon side of things, is of course that when you increase the price of something that hurts society, such as petrol and its use, and then reinvest in something that benefits society, and this can be in different ways. This can go directly towards infrastructure, into efficient types of infrastructure, or you even go in an entirely different direction, for example, reducing the cost of social security, so basically reducing the tax burden on everyone. And then you have measures that are fiscally discouraging and encouraging at the same time, and will bring together the generation of funds and the investment of funds. And of course, this goes on to the vehicle taxation as well. And standardization is a critical element to move industry towards the provision of efficient types of vehicles that is so important then for individuals to basically being able to find an appropriate vehicle on the market, which of course for electric mobility has been and is still being a little bit still challenging for some, because the industry is so much focusing on high-end types of vehicles which are not affordable to everyone. So here, of course, public procurement and fleets can also help a lot, for example, with the electrification of bus fleets, to create a critical mass also for industry to basically enter markets. It's something that we see in smaller markets, not as much as in Indonesia, but in other markets where basically products are not readily available yet. And of course, this is a similar chicken egg situation in the charging side of things. So when we want to electrify a vehicle fleet, we need to be able to provide first opportunities to purchase a vehicle and then to be able to charge it. So we cannot wait until the vehicle fleet is big enough to then make it viable to create a charging system, but we do need to provide one that is providing the security to move around safely and charge your vehicle. And of course, there are also a lot of local measures on the fiscal side of things, just to mention a few: road pricing, parking pricing, and access rules. This provides an opportunity for a city to generate funding to reinvest into walking, cycling, public transport infrastructure, and at the same time, as we said earlier, discourages the use of the private vehicles so that people can make a conscious decision on the economics and the reliability of the mobility that they are using on a daily basis, and then come up with a right answer for the day. What am I willing to pay today, and how reliable is the mode of transportation that I need? And here, local measures like those can be very impactful and effective. And of course, sure, in some cases, in particular, to get a certain segment going on picking up new technologies, subsidies and investments are quite important, but we should not rely on them for a longer period, right? That, as we said, there's a lot on economic gains to be made in the transport sector decarbonization. So the balance is only to bridge the gap through subsidies maybe or fee-bates at a certain point, and then phase this out because it basically pays for itself. And of course, there are market-based mechanisms as well that are quite relevant, and I just wanted to touch on them here because it's Henry will dive in deeper onto those. But of course, this all fits together in the whole spectrum of generating funding and investing in the right way. So, of course, what we need to remove instantly is any fossil fuel subsidies because they are costing taxpayer dollars and hurt society. So this is, of course, rather suboptimal as something that we would need, and come up with a differentiated pricing system at all levels that enables people to use efficient modes of transportation and helps with the shift towards electrifying the entirety of the fleet. When we look at the packaging, of course, here, as I mentioned, it's quite critical to think about the whole spectrum across planning, infrastructure, fiscal, regulatory measures at the national and local level and how they are intertwined, right? If we only do a piecemeal of those, we'll always have suboptimal outcomes. And of course, if we have competing political interests among the national and local level, this will also lead to ineffective use of funds. It will always also have that discouragement of people feeling not the opportunity to choose the right mode of transport, but basically having having to have a car because there are no proper alternatives. And this is where the interplay between the national frameworks and the local frameworks and the implementation is so critical. And, you know, this summarizes some of the solutions that we just mentioned. So there are plenty of opportunities to create co-benefits and to create a broad coalition among players. And of course, we need to give a price signal, we need to generate revenue, and we need to invest. And this then provides an accessible and affordable transport system that really provides the trust that people need, that I have the opportunity to choose, and I choose the most efficient and affordable way of transportation. And that helps us having a socially just transition towards decarbonized transport. So, of course, when we look at different sectors in the field, passenger vehicles are now becoming very affordable, or more affordable than they used to be, electric types of vehicles, and 2- and 3-wheelers are already highly affordable and very competitively priced. So their transition is very viable. So bringing the price down for those types of vehicles is not a key driver anymore towards providing subsidies or fee-bates for those, but still providing key infrastructures and integrating all those alternatives into a mix of transportation opportunities is critical. And maybe I'll just also quickly talk about the freight and logistics part of things, because this is a different interplay, of course, that we have with freight and logistics providers, where, of course, there are regulatory elements as well that you could implement in, for example, identifying clean freight zones and vehicle standards for fleet management and similar solutions. And of course, In the heavy truck, in the heavy freight field, we have still a bit of a challenge of electrifying trucking. So here, of course, modal shift towards rail is critical, and logistical elements like consolidating trips is quite important. And then when we design the package, we always need to have the objectives of the key players in mind and trying to bring them together. And this is where the co-benefits can come in so handy. And what we would need maybe as a key takeaway is that no, there's no silver bullet, there is no single instrument that can decarbonize the entirety of the sector. Pricing is such a key element in the whole dynamic of discouraging use and then being able to reinvest into encouraging people to move around more sustainably. Standards are a key element for the insurance of the availability of certain types of vehicles and making sure that the industry moves in that direction, but it needs to go hand in hand with the overall differentiated pricing. And of course, then using these funds that we have generated into sustainable modes of transportation creates also the trust and legitimacy that you need to make the overall package work. And of course, that brings us to the last point from my side, the packaging of measures and actors. And if once we start identifying our solutions, and of course, you might be in different line ministries or in local governments. So your responsibility is usually not the entire package, but parts of it. But of course, here you need to be thinking of building coalitions with key allies at the local and national level at the start once you do that. And you need to be able to identify where in the overall policy package your measure is that you would like to pursue and where the current shortfalls are, for example. And here, of course, it is always important, and this is why I keep mentioning the co-benefits and synergies with other policy areas, is that your peers in the field at the local and national level, they may have different policy objectives. They may not be interested, or sure, they are interested in all policy objectives, but their responsibility may lie somewhere else. So you need to be able to identify which objectives are being positively or negatively affected by the measure that you're aiming for, because then you can map the colleagues that you need to talk to, basically. And for this, it's quite important to make the links between the policies and the outcomes and the institutions and processes that are related to those. And I'm here, of course, the mapping starts with elements like climate and access and energy, health and safety, finance, industry and jobs, just to mention some of the key objectives that are relevant. Of course, this comes all hand in hand, and wherever we approach this, we can create either synergies or trade-offs. So, one standard example that you could give in this context is, for example, the drive towards dieselization in Europe after the 1970s oil crisis, where there was the drive towards more efficient types of vehicles, so diesel-powered vehicles that are technically more efficient than petrol-powered vehicles. Then we had basically a double stumble on this, where air quality deteriorated in many European cities, and at the same time, as diesel was not properly taxed to balance takebacks out, vehicles became heavier and more powerful, and the initially good idea, but not well packaged was then basically not making things better, but even worse. So we want to avoid these kinds of trade-offs, and this is where we need to be able to focus on the entirety of the spectrum. I have 5 more minutes, have I? Once we map out the process that we follow in our path towards bringing forward a solution, it might be quite useful to think about a process like this, where we look at what is our mandate and what is the mandate of our peers that we would need, and what is the baseline that we're basically addressing. So where are we standing now and where we would like to go? And what do we need to package around our individual solution? Who can pay for it and who needs to be able to regulate this? How do we procure if this is something that requires procurement, and how do we deliver, and how do we check also later on what the benefits of it was? Because obviously this creates the level of trust back on that we have the evidence to show that our measure brings the impact that we would need. And of course, when we look at this from a CO2 perspective, then of course the net zero target is a great starting point. And how do we get there? That we break this down to individual sectors, and of course within the sector then there might be different dynamics in the decarbonization. And of course we cannot just look at our individual sector. Obviously, throughout the electrification of transport, the interconnection between transport and electricity is very obvious. And this is where we need to align decarbonization paths as well to not just shift emissions from one place to another. And a key element in that entire spectrum is to look at who makes decisions when and where. And here, of course, in particular, looking at what we would call veto players, so someone who in this process may be able to pull the plug entirely. So that's, of course, a key actor. Finance Ministry is an obvious one as an example that we need to bring along very early on. Accountability, of course, is a critical element that we have a driving force behind of those. We touched upon the ASEF spectrum already, the activity, the structure, the intensity, and the fuels. So this brings us back together to the scenarios that we need to develop to have a convincing case that we have a path here that contributes towards the decarbonization of the sector, but then also towards being able to pay for it and identifying key performance indicators, the KPIs. This is something that is quite relevant to do in co-design with the key actors that we've identified earlier on. And that brings us back to our little package around where are we in the spectrum. Let's say we want to introduce a new standard for the vehicle fleet. How does that relate to other measures that we have currently in place and that I have yet to come? What is the contribution if we approach this in the current policy environment? So basically that also shows the need for a package, because you always need to be able to convince your colleagues basically to develop complementing measures and not competing measures. So mapping institutional players and their responsibilities. So for example, in here, the Finance Ministry introducing differentiated pricing. But then, of course, this needs to go well hand in hand with, for example, then the local authorities to invest into public transport alternatives. Otherwise, this, of course, would create a big backlash to the national government for making petrol or vehicles more expensive. So that relationship, of course, is very critical to bring together. So can't state enough how closely linked national and local measures need to be. And this is, of course, where we start with an initial idea. We always need to be up for going forth and back to the drawing board when we look at the feasibility of individual measures. Then transferring this from the feasibility to its finance and procurement is so important to reap the benefits of the overall operational and capital costs that we can save through the entirety of a life cycle. So here a good example is the procurement of electric buses for a vehicle fleet. Here, of course, the whole life cycle of the vehicle needs to be taken into account, and that, of course, may compete with operators who have short-term gains in mind. So the whole procurement opportunities that in particular cities and public transport operators have can be a key critical stepstone towards electrifying those vehicle fleets, for example. So regulations and standards and incentives are closely linked, right, as we said. So this is where carrot and stick are coming together. Basically, we do provide the need for industry to provide more efficient vehicles, and then incentivizing those at the starting point, having in mind that overall, once the dynamics in the market allow, we need to face those. Procurement, as I said, is a important lever for public authorities. And when we look into the implementation partnership, a simple map like this might just do the trick as an initial start. Of course, here also the interplay not just between the local and national government, but also with private sector players is quite important. And here, of course, competing interests might be quite challenging to bring together. So this is where a balance of objectives is so important to bring together in the institutional architecture. So,
Prof. La, sorry, do you
Yeah.
have 2 minutes remaining? If
I
you
have
can.
2 minutes remaining. Okay, I was that's great. So I'm nearing the end. So for the mapping, it's quite important to look at the different types of actors and their role in the field and their influence and how essential the support for them is. So a basic little map like the one that I'm sharing here might be quite useful. And then you identify the key gaps in the field, so the mandates, the continuity that is important. And when you look at this from an overall perspective, it might be quite nice to look at this from a safe system perspective, that we bring the integrated physical system, so the infrastructures and services that we provide with the governance system and the responsibilities of players together in our mapping activities. And that helps us through the entire spectrum. And maybe here we go. I'll just finish with this. So the institutional mapping is important to reap the co-benefits and synergies. Players need to think about this in a systemic way, even though they might just be responsible for individual segments. And then we have a long-term continuity that helps us really with the transition of the entire sector over the longer term. And with this, I would hand over to my colleague Henry Weiss for the next part of the presentation. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Prof. Lasso, for your very insightful presentation. Let me recap for 1 minute that the avoid shift and also improve implementation framework is kind of a one integrated transport implementation, and also how fiscal and also non-fiscal mechanism, and there is several instruments for this kind of financing for the decarbonization, and also under the decarbonization policies, it is also will be specific for every country and also on different level, national, regional, and also local. And the other things is what we need is to have a good planning and also preparation in terms of policy and also institutional planning to ensure the successful execution of this kind of design for the decarbonization. I think that's the main recap of the presentation. Is there any participant that will ask? You can put quickly on the chat room and also when we have our second session. Then, without further ado, I will invite Mr. Henry Weiss for our second session. So Mr. Henry Rich is a lecturer in Kazakh and German University with more of 30 years expertise of climate, environment, and also sustainable infrastructure. Without further ado, I please this for the time and also the screen for Mr. Henry Weiss. Please.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see my screen right now.
Yes, we can see.
Yeah, hold on. Look, great. First of all, thank you to my colleague, to condense all that in a short note is quite difficult. I'm currently working actually for the European Union in Rwanda, a country in Africa, as climate policy advisor dealing with the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Environment. And the first question which people always ask me is, how are we going to finance that? How are we going to finance the mobilization of, let's say, an electric fleet for a country like Rwanda? Rwanda has already, the city buses are all electric, and probably around 25-30% of the private cars are electric. So these things are possible, and I think I would like to share some of the experiences also with you which have come up. So the first question people ask me, how do we finance this transition? The second element is, how do we provide incentives? How do we create the right incentive through carbon pricing instruments, which are effective, which are fair, and which are adapted to the circumstances? And we are talking now about Indonesia. And the third element is, how do we measure the progress in decarbonization through credible calculation standards, creating reliable data and robust verification system. And all this is something which I would like to address in my presentation. You see these three subject areas: global decarbonization calculation standards, carbon financing mechanisms, and carbon pricing instruments. All this is what I'm trying to knock down in 45 minutes. So Indonesia is an very interesting country for this kind of discussion. Its sheer size, the kind of large urban growth, the demand for transport, but also the climate ambition makes these challenges significant, but it's also a very large opportunity. So what we will do is we will first measure carbon dioxide emissions. We will then establish a kind of price for it. And then we think how to finance the whole exercise. So fasten your seatbelts, please. Wait. So first element, I will talk about global decarbonization calculation standards of the traffic sector. This is what has been asked actually by the ministry. This first element out of three is structured in 4 elements: international greenhouse gas inventory frameworks. And we will review the main international greenhouse gas inventory frameworks, including the IPCC guideline, the greenhouse gas protocol, the ISO International Standard Organization standards, but also city-level protocols. Secondly, we will explain the core calculation methodologies. In principle, this is very easy. This is activity multiplied by an emission factor, and these emission factors or these kind of standard calculations can be looked up from various systems. And thirdly, we will apply this method to road transport using both distance-based and fuel-based examples. And finally, we will look at the sources of this data, particularly at the issue of MRV monitoring, and verification, reporting and verification practices, but also how to deal with uncertainty. So this was something like the structure of the first element. Let me go to this kind of IPCC guideline. This is the global standard. The IPCC stands for International Panel on Climate Change. This is the organization which basically is in charge of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the IPCC guidelines are the global reference for national greenhouse gas inventories. It's interesting to see that the first IPCC guidelines in 2006, they were already dealing with the main categories of transportation, about road transport, about railways, about domestic aviation, but also about domestic navigation. So this was the basic, the 2006 guidelines, 2006 guidelines, and 2019, a refinement appeared. It became more detailed. So emission factors were updated, they provided improved guidance on methodological choices, etc. So for Indonesia, it's important both of these work together, 2016 and 2019. And a main element of that is that they have a layered approach. Tier 1, layer number 1, uses default global emission factors. The second level uses country-specific factors, in this case Indonesia, and the third element uses more detailed models of measured data which has really been measured on the ground. And this allows a country like Indonesia to start with a simple methodology and improve accuracy over time as better data become available. So this were the global standards. Now we go a little bit down the level. We talk about corporate and organizational standards, corporate for industries. So this next group of standards translates the same calculation logic into reporting at the company level or at the organization level. The first one is the so-called Greenhouse Gas Protocol for Corporate Standards, and that's mostly used by companies accounting carbon dioxide accounting frameworks. In transport, Scope 1 focuses really on direct fuels, the use of direct fuel, how much is being used by company-owned vehicles. Scope number 2 deals with the energy which you buy, for example, the electricity which you use for an electric fleet or for a railway system. And scope number 3 goes down really on a much lower level, which deals with value chain emissions, for example, logistics or business travels or outsourced transport services. So this is on the corporate level. If you go now to the kind of organizational or project level, there is an ISO International Standard Organization standard, which is ISO I4064. This is not transport specific. This is just basically dealing for a project level, estimating greenhouse level emissions. If it would be more specific for the transport sector, you go to one which is called ISO 14083. This is relatively new and it's specific for the transport sector. And this one, this ISO 14083, I'm sorry, these are very much details, but it's important. This is closely aligned, which is called the GLEC framework. GLEC stands for Global Logistic Emission Framework, and it's universal methods for calculating logistic emissions. So you have these, we have now gone down from a global level, down to the corporate level, and down really to the project level. These are methods on how to calculate your carbon dioxide emissions. You can go even further down. You can go to the city level or the subnational protocols. There is one, it's called the Global Protocol for City, GPC. That was developed by the World Resource Institute, C40, which is something like a club of 40 major cities dealing with carbon dioxide emission reduction, and ICLAI, which is an organization which brings together cities, but in particular city majors. And this GPC provides something like a harmonized approach for city-level greenhouse gas accounting. For transport, cities normally account for scope 1, vehicles within the city boundaries. Scope 2 goes again a little bit further down. It covers grid supplies, electricity used for transport, for example, for electric railway system, for metro systems, tram systems, etc. And scope 3 can include also transboundary trips, aviation, shipping, and supply chain transport emission where relevant. The important thing in this whole exercise is transparency. Cities must clearly define the boundaries of these kind of protocols in which they apply it, explain which modes have been included, travel modes have been included, document which kind of data sources were used, and disclose also assumptions. Sometimes you have to make assumptions in these exercises. But the easy thing to make it really easy is this core formula is always the same. Across all these standards which I had indicated, the core formula is emissions equals activity data multiplied by an emission factor, nothing else. Huh? But there are two approaches. One is called fuel-based approach, and the other one is called distance-based approach. So on the fuel-based approach, the emissions are calculated from the amount of fuel which have been consumed or which have been sold. So carbon dioxide equals fuel consumption, and here in this case, a terajoules multiplied by an emission factor expressed as ton of carbon dioxide. This is a fuel-based approach, how much fuel has been consumed or sold. You can also look from a different perspective. You can use the so-called distance-based approach. The distance-based approach calculates emission from the vehicle kilometers or passenger kilometers, or if it's transport, the ton kilometers, multiplied by an emission factor per kilometer or passenger kilometer. And this method is particularly useful when a detailed activity data exists by mode. Important to remember, both approaches are valid. Both the fuel-based approach you can apply, but also the distance-based approach. All this is necessary later on in order to figure out how are you going to get the money for your activities. I come later back to that. Activity data, emission factors, and levels, tire levels. So the IPCC system helps determine the level of detail and the uncertainty of an emission estimate. Tire 1 is the most core system, it's the simplest method. It uses coarse activity data like total fuel consumption or default emission factors from IPCC tables. It's useful when you don't have the data, when data are limited, but when the uncertainty is relatively high. If you go down a level lower, this becomes more detailed. It's stratified by vehicle categories. The emission factors are probably national, probably Indonesia has something, or even regional, and the uncertainty decreases. And with tier 3, you go down in further detail. You can look at the vehicle type, you can look at what kind of fuel, it's diesel fuel or petrol or gas, and you can look also at street conditions, and the emission factor is more specific and the uncertainty gets lower and lower and lower. So once you move from this tier 1 to tier 3, you get better and better data. Let me give you one example on road transport. The scenario is very easy. It's a passenger car using, for example, gasoline or petrol with an annual travel of 10 billion passenger kilometers. We apply a certain emission factor, which is from the IPCC, which is 0.12 kilograms per carbon dioxide per passenger kilometer, and the calculation is relatively straightforward. So 10 billion passenger kilometers multiplied by 0.12 kilograms carbon dioxide per passenger kilometer, then you come to 1.2 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. Sometimes it's also important to look at sensitivity analysis in this exercise. Why I'm so detailed right now is all this is needed if you later apply for climate financing. So this is an important thing. It's not just scientific ideas, etc. You will be requested for all kind of climate finance, on which we will talk later on, for these kind of details. Here I talked about distance-based calculation. This is about fuel-based calculation. Fuel-based calculations is preferred when you have reliable data about the sales of fuel or the consumption data are available. This is often easier to implement at the national level because fuel statistics may become more complete when detailed vehicle kilometer data are there. Very often petrol companies can provide this kind of data. So sometimes it's easier to go in this calculation, look at fuel-based calculations. The difference between the results of a fuel-based result and a distance-based result is not a problem. It's something like a diagnostic signal. You have to look at both, and it tells you, the difference tells you to review the assumption behind each of these methods. You have to look at load factors of occupancy, of fuel economy of your cars, etc. And cross-checking top-down fuel data from bottom-up activities gives you something like a core MRV practice already. So this is an important element in all the calculations for climate, for getting climate finance. Oops, I like this. These are some key data sources and reference which you might want to use. As I said, the IPCC guidelines, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and the GLEC framework on the emission factors. With respect to activity data, you can use UN data from the International Energy Agency, from Eurostat, the Statistical Office of the European Union, can also provide additional information. You can look in the case of, let's say, use of energy for agricultural development, etc. You can look at data from the FAO. I'm pretty sure your national agencies have data, etc. So you will have to bring all this data together in order to be ready for climate finance. As I said, MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification, is crucial. This is what turns an emission calculation into a credible inventory or mitigation assessment. And the best practice is usually using documentation, record data sources, bring this data together. You have to look at the quality of the data, and you have to have an uncertainty assessment. You will never be sure exactly what are you talking about, but you have to describe this uncertainty and then later on report and present this based on the uncertainty statement with full confidence, or as much confidence as you might have. So in summary, all major standards, IPCC, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, ISO, International Standard Organization, GLEC, they all converge on the same calculation. Activity multiplied by an emission factor approach, and all that is relatively easy. I have listed some of these reference for further reading, but this is something like the starting point. Why? Because we want to go to the next point. How do we get money for what we do? Carbon financing mechanisms. The central question is, how can transport decarbonization be financed? Issues like electric buses, charging infrastructures, batteries, cleaner logistics, all this requires upfront investment. So carbon finance can help close this gap by converting emissions which have been verified. We have been verified the reductions by the ways which we have described earlier into revenue, into money, by paying for measured results or by using public capital to attract private investments. Now, in this kind of part of my presentation, we will look at three different approaches. International carbon markets, we will look into financing instruments and the governance of those, and we will look at impact and outlook. So let me start with global carbon mechanisms. Oops, sorry. Oops. Here we are. Under the Paris Agreement of the UNFCCC, verified emissions which can be verified, can become something like a financial asset, something if they meet these strict accounting and verification standards, which I had described earlier. For the transport sector, this is particularly relevant because many clean mobility projects produce measurable emissions, but they struggle to attract finance at the beginning. Everybody knows if you replace an old diesel bus with an electric bus, this reduces emissions dramatically, but how are you going to finance an electric bus at the beginning? And so the Article 6 and the result-based payments can turn this into sources of funding. Whoops. So, number one, international carbon markets. Important is the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which allows countries to cooperate by transferring verified mitigation outcomes from one country to the other. So if you have a verified, let's say, reduction of carbon dioxide emissions in Indonesia, you can bring this on the market, you can sell that. And these units are called International Transferred Mitigation Outcomes, ITMOs. One ITMO is equal to 1 ton of carbon dioxide which has been avoided and reduced. So if you use electric buses instead of petrol buses and you reduce by a certain number of tons of carbon dioxide, you can sell these kind of international transfer mitigation outcomes to other countries. So in practical terms, a country can monetize verified emission reductions from a transport project. And the revenue from selling these ITMOs can then help to make a clean transport investment financially viable. And that is particularly important for projects like electric bus fleets because the upfront costs for electric buses are high, but the emission savings are very measurable. It's quite a lot. There was a very good example in the past in Bangkok. There was the so-called Bangkok e-bus program. Thailand, in Bangkok, they deployed more than 2,000 electric buses, replacing diesel engines and reducing emissions. And so within a year, the kind of program generated 50,000 ITMOs. These were sold to a foundation in Switzerland, which used them towards the climate targets of Switzerland, But the revenue, the money which came from Switzerland, supported the financial viability of this kind of bus fleet in Bangkok. The key message is that international carbon markets can create a direct financial link between measured transport emissions, reductions of carbon dioxide, for example, in Indonesia, and new investment in clean mobility. Now we have to broaden a little bit the discussion from carbon markets to the wider financing instruments and governance arrangements which make clean transport investments possible. Transport projects often need more than just one single financing tool. They must require concessional loans, they might require grants, they might require guarantees, carbon revenues, on strong institutional system to measure and verify these results. And so in the next chapter, I will talk a little bit about these kind of issues. Let me start with blended finance and guarantees. If we talk about transport projects, they face something like a fundamental financing challenge. Technologies like electric buses, batteries, and charging infrastructure often have very high upfront capital costs, even when operating costs are lower over time. So an electric bus over time is cheaper to operate, but at the beginning it's a massive investment. And that can make private investors probably more hesitant, in particular in markets where the demand, regulation, and revenue streams are a little bit uncertain, it's all a little bit vague. This can be addressed by blended finance. Blended finance addresses by combining this public funding and private capital. Public actors such as government or development banks, like whatever, the PTSMI in Indonesia or KfW, they can provide concessional loans, they can provide guarantees, or even first loss capital. And that absorbs part of the initial risk and improves the risk-return profile for private investors. So there are three key components. First, public capital can take the most risky position. In a way, they signal by that confidence and reducing the downside risk. Secondly, private investors can then contribute commercial capital under more attractive conditions. And third, guarantees can cover potential losses and reduce the cost of capital for the project. All that, to give an example, for example, if we're talking here with KfW, and it was called the Responsibility Asia Climate Fund, that illustrates this approach. KfW committed 58 million as a first loss tranche. This was risk capital. The public commitment had mobilized more than $300 million in total funding for low carbon technology, which included electric vehicles, batteries, and charging infrastructure. So the broad lesson is there is a multiplier effect. A small amount of public money can unlock a much larger amount of private investment. This is why blended finance is especially relevant for clean mobility, because it helps projects from technologically desirable to financially being bankable. So this is something blended finance. But there's another element, which is called result-based payments, carbon for infrastructure. That's another important mechanism, is result-based payment, sometimes described as carbon for infrastructure. The principle is relatively simple. Money is paid only after verified outcomes have been delivered. Let's say, unlike a traditional grant where funds might be dispersed upfront, result-based finance links payment to a measurable result. So somebody, a funder or an implementer, agrees on a target, for example, a defined number of tons of carbon dioxide which has been reduced, or a specific number of buses have been converted. The implementer then delivers the project using its own money or international climate funding or borrowed capital, etc. But once an independent auditor verifies that these kind of achieved results have been done, then actually the funder disperses payment. Funding can come from different sources, in that respect. Climate funds, for example, as a Green Climate Fund, are doing sometimes result-based payments. It can be concessional aid from bilateral donors or private capital seeking verified climate impact. So there are great opportunities for that. As I said, for all this, MRV baselines and additionality are something like backbones of climate finance integrity. You need a credible baseline. Without this, no project will operate. And we talked about this. You can look at these various guidelines as I had described at the beginning. But then is another element. This is additionality. Very often people forget about that. In order to get climate finance, you have to prove additionality. You have to demonstrate that emission reduction happen because of the financing mechanism and not because they would happen in any case. So if the country finances a railway line out by its own, this is very good, and it becomes probably saving carbon dioxide emissions. But if you just prove only that this happens in any case, then the element of additionality is missing. Then you are not eligible for climate finance. And the third element is what I call independent verification. You have to basically avoid, for example, double counting. When carbon credits are being transferred international, the seller makes a corresponding adjustment, for Indonesia in this case, by subtracting the transferred reduction from its own climate accounting. This is important. Oops. Third element is impact and outlook. The previous slides described the mechanism. This section looks now at what can be delivered in reality. Some, let's say, real-world experiences. I talked about this Bangkok e-bus program. So carbon financing, this clean transport project actually reduced by approximately 500,000 tons of carbon dioxide by 2030. So more than 2,000 buses were financed in Bangkok. But there are also other things. I talked about this kind of German climate finance leadership. KfW has used first loss capital to help de-risk investment in low carbon technologies across Asia. And this type of public finance is designed to mobilize larger private investments of electric vehicles. Important is this combined effect, which is important. ITMOs, these carbon credits, create revenue from verified emission reductions. Result payments, I talked about that, ensure that money is linked to actual delivery. Blended finance reduces upfront investment risk and attracts private capital. And together means climate finance, result-based payment, and blended finance. All that can make an electric bus fleet or another clean transport project economically viable, feasible in markets where otherwise a country, for example, like Indonesia, might struggle to get the financing together. And this is key, to get this kind of composite picture together between various finance elements. So this is, I'll do that a little bit quicker. And now we come to carbon pricing instruments. I think I still have some time.
Yes, you still have 15 minutes.
Okay, good. I try to do it as quick as possible. It's not easy. It's these are all very complex issues. And in principle, all of them could be elements of further discussions, in much more detail. So, carbon pricing instruments for the transport sector. So this is again structured in 3 elements. We will clarify the core concepts of carbon pricing, especially emission trading system and carbon taxes. Then we will look at European experiences, including the European emission trading system, Germany's, which is called BEHG. Germany is very famous for creating very long words. You know, in particular, when we create laws, we have crazy words. It's called Bundesemissionshandelsgesetz. It's one word. You know, nobody can pronounce that, which is a federal emission trading law. And we also look at Sweden's carbon tax. And thirdly, we will discuss Indonesia. We'll discuss what this could mean actually for Indonesia in terms of coverage, pricing, revenue use, and implementation. Next one. So, carbon pricing concepts. The 2 main forms of carbon pricing are emission trading systems and carbon taxes. And both instruments create an economic signals. So whoever emits carbon emissions either reduces emissions or he pays actually for the emissions they continue to generate. So one of these concepts is trying to reduce overall emissions. The other concept is, yes, you can emit as much as you want, but you have to pay a higher and higher price for that. I think it's important to understand the differences between these instruments before we move to practical example and possible implications for Indonesia. Okay, as I said, 2 kind of pricing instruments, emission trading systems and carbon taxes. Carbon pricing puts a price, an economic value on greenhouse gas emission. An emission trading system like the ETS is a cap and trade mechanism. So it's an overall cap. You're not allowed to produce more emissions, but you allow covered entities to trade allowances. So this is part of the European environment policy. You might know that in Europe, environmental policy is mainly coming from Brussels. So for the member states of the European Union, environmental law initially comes from Brussels, and this is translated into national law, and then you can go further than the European Union, but you cannot go lower than what has been decided at the level of the European Union. So all European member states are part of the emission trading system. This, by having a cap over it, by not going beyond this emission, it provides an environmental certainty because the cap determines the emission outcome, while the market determines the price. So basically, you can you know how many million tons of carbon dioxide can be produced per year, but you have to basically look at technologies or actually buy yourself emission carbon credits from other companies. So there is a kind of internal market, but with an overall cap. A carbon tax is differently. You know, it fixes the price of carbon dioxide, very often through taxation of fuel prices at the petrol station, but it doesn't have a hard emission cap. So if you're ready to pay a lot and a very much, actually, you can drive as much as you want with a very big car and produce carbon dioxide emission as you want, but you pay a higher and higher price for that. So the World Bank has sometimes described that quite nicely. It has said, you know, an ETS, an environmental trading system, provides certainty about the environmental impact, but it has a flexible price, where a carbon tax guarantees the price, but it does not guarantee the outcome of emissions. Both instruments can generate government incomes. I'm always thinking about how can Indonesia pay for the decarbonization of its traffic sector. So both instruments, both an environmental trading system and a carbon tax, can generate internal government revenues. This revenue can then be used for clean transport infrastructure, for example, for clean transport infrastructure. Very often you see countries that they use a mix between both jurisdictions, a mix of both instruments, and introduce them also in phases. It's not just from one second to the other, you just come with a very high carbon tax. The key design trade-offs are between price certainty, that you fix the price, emission certainty, you have to make it administrative simple, and you have to make it politically acceptable. Some experience from Europe. Europe provides useful example because it combines these several types of carbon pricing. The European trading system is a central cap and trade system for the power installation, for power producers, industry, for aviation and maritime transport. But Germany has also introduced a national fuel emission trading system for transport and heating fuels. Sweden uses a little bit a different approach. They have what is being known now in the meantime as the world's highest carbon taxes. These examples are not models to copy mechanically, but they can provide probably some inspiration on how you sequence the introduction of these kind of systems in order to get the revenues for the decarbonization of Indonesia's traffic system, but also how to govern it and how to ensure public acceptance, because this is also a key element. It's a political issue. So carbon in pricing in Europe, this is a comparison. How this happened, in Germany and Sweden, but also with the EU fuel taxes as well as the EU environmental emission trading system. The EU environment emission trading system, they cover, as I said before, power, industry, aviation, and ships. It's based on a declining cap. So the cap of carbon dioxide emission rights is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. It relies on very strict monitoring rules. Companies under these rules have to annually report. There are penalties also for non-compliance. So this is working. It's right now under discussion again, but for a long time this has been working very well, and that's the kind of system for let's say emission trading. Then we have this kind of German system BEHG, which deals upstream to transport and heating fuels. It started with fixed prices around whatever, €25 to $55 per ton. And now it moves into auctioning. So it's a more flexible approach later on. And this phased approach created predictability for the consumer and companies, which gradually built their institutional system. Sweden used these kind of carbon taxes. They apply broadly to fossil fuel which is used outside the European trading system. And they started with a very low price, $23 per ton in 1991. And now it's already 138 tons per ton. And this can be administered relatively easy because that's being done through whenever you go to the petrol station, you basically pay for it, which makes the enforcement comparatively straightforward. The main lessons when you look at these kind of examples for Indonesia is that a phased approach can work well. Start with predictable prices. Don't come up with enormous prices at the beginning. Strengthen the administrative system, strengthen the MRV system. Gradually move towards a more market-based pricing and a broader coverage. First, we probably just start taxing car drivers and then basically go to other buses, public transport, maritime transport, domestic aviation, and also revenues recycling is essentially to build public acceptance. Particularly you might want to recycle a certain amount of the money, especially when households or small business face higher fuel cost. So you increase the cost for fuel, but you recycle a certain amount basically to people which are poor and are socially requiring this. Chapter 3 is transport application in Indonesia.
Sorry, you have 5 minutes remaining.
Super. Then I'm basically through. This is good timing. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you.
We are now basically examining how carbon pricing applies to different transport subsectors and what that means for Indonesia. So road transport is the largest sort of transport emissions in Indonesia, but you have also aviation, you have internal shipping, you have rail systems, etc., and they raise different design and enforcement challenges. So for any transport carbon pricing policy, the distributional impacts and MRV requirements are really central. A technically sound instrument will not be sustainable until it is fair, until it is transparent, and until it is administratively feasible. Yep. So pricing in transport subsectors and key challenges. Road transport should be the first priority because it accounts for what I understood the vast majority of transport emissions in Indonesia. In Europe, as I said earlier, fuel taxes are the main practical tool for road transport and already imply a significant carbon prices. In Indonesia, the situation is different. Fuel taxes are lower than EU levels and fuel subsidies are politically sensitive. Yeah? And that's important to take also into account the sensitivity of the people which are using their motorbikes or buses, etc. Aviation and maritime transport require rather specific approaches. Aviation is covered by the European trading system for flights inside the European Union. And there's another system by IATA, it's called CORSIA for international aviation. Maritime transport in Europe entered the European trading system already in 2024 for large ships, but Indonesia could probably consider pricing bunker fuels or requiring allowances at ports, particularly for larger operators. As I said earlier, distributional impacts are a major concern. Fuel increases can affect low-income households, rural communities, small operators, or small trucking businesses. You might consider revenue recycling into parts of the society which is economically not that strong from these kind of fuel taxes. Also important is MRV. If you want to go into selling carbon credits, you need a very strong MRV system as a key element for entering the international carbon market. A kind of staged approach for Indonesia, which came to my mind. Phase 1, start with road fuel suppliers, that expand to domestic aviation, inter-island shipping, later address rail ports and make alignment with international measures. Carbon pricing will work best when combined with complementary policies, such as fuel efficiency standards, incentives for electric vehicle, investment into public transport and capacity building, also of officials, what we are doing right now. So last thing, design option and roadmap for Indonesia. This is in principle a combination of what we have started to do, start with a kind of hybrid approach, start with fixed prices, create legislation with signals intent. Don't start immediately with a high price, but basically give a kind of indication that you would like to introduce that, and make also sure that you recycle a certain part of the revenue, which is getting into the budget of the Ministry of Finance, probably to social distressed parts of the society. This could be a kind of implementation roadmap, and these are the key stakeholders. This is pretty much the same system which we did in Rwanda, actually, by the way. So we got all, not Bapenas, but we got all the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Environment, and Ministry of Infrastructure as part of that. And that has worked quite well. I am in time, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sir Mr. Henry. So very, right in time to finish the presentation and very detailed presentation and also explanation to us. Thank you so much. So dear participant, I already got several questions through the Zoom chat and also the YouTube. So I will start the question and answer session. So there are 3 questions currently. I will go through all of that, and maybe Professor Oliver and also Mr. Hendrich can respond it later. So the first question from Ibu Vina Rosalina from Transjakarta. Maybe this question for both of you, Pak. So for the public transport operators running by a subsidies buy and service scheme, are there examples of the countries that successfully integrated the carbon offset or carbon credit from the fleet electrification with an existing subsidy scheme without creating a double counting issue on the carbon offset and also carbon credit? That's the first question. And also the second question, I think this more to Prof. Oliver. What is the international standard that can be applied to measure the carbon inventory in various sectors in Indonesia? Maybe the lesson learned from the other country to be applied in the similar characteristic of Indonesia. And the third question from, I think this is more sufficient to Mr. Hendrich. How is the requirement or the modality to apply the carbon cap mechanism in Indonesia? Does it require a carbon cap regulation, and what is actually the main aspect to regulate under that kind of regulation for carbon cap? That's the question for based on the session today. Maybe I give over to Prof. Lah to respond it first, and then go to the Mr. Hendrich.
Great, thanks a lot. I do believe that both questions are more from Henry's presentation and from mine. So maybe I'll let Henry go first and then jump in if there's something on my end.
Okay, thank you. Over to Mr.
Henry. So I think just coming back to the question of Rosaline, I can just talk about, an example in Rwanda, where I'm currently living. Public transport has been transformed rather radical, positively into towards electric vehicles. However, I have to say, now it sounds wonderful, but Rwanda is a very small country geographically. So from one corner to the other, it's around 300 kilometers. It's very densely populated, 300 kilometers. But what happened is carbon credits have been created. They were sold to Singapore. Singapore basically could reduce its own carbon footprint by buying them. The money was, let's say the carbon credits were then deducted actually from Rwanda, because Rwanda cannot produce these twice for its own sake and for Singapore. And but the valuable point, and that's key element, is Rwanda has an excellent MRV system. So there is a kind of accounting system for carbon credits, which is internationally recognized. So we created that. So these ITMOs are being acknowledged by the IPCC under Article 6, and so this transfer was possible. So it's an opportunity. In this case, there was not only ITMOs, but there was also a mixture, as I said earlier, between blended finance, private investors, but also a kind of initial commitment actually by bilateral donors to provide certain upfront funding. How then the second question, what were the requirements? What are the requirements for a carbon cap? Was that right? Could you just repeat the third question?
The third question, yes, what is required for the carbon cap mechanism to be applied? How is about the modality, and also maybe the main aspect to be regulated for the carbon cap?
In principle, the best thing is not either this or that carbon credit or carbon taxes, but basically make a kind of combination. Once you have a carbon cap, you start even reducing the carbon emissions which are running under this carbon cap, and you have a slow increase of prices for these carbon units. That basically allows for a trading among companies themselves. Whatever airlines could buy or sell these things, or electricity producers, etc. So carbon cap will not very often not only apply only for the traffic sector, but also for the energy sector and other sectors. Let's say carbon credit, if carbon taxes have principal advantage, they're much easier to apply, because you just look at, you go to a petrol station and you increase the price by a certain factor, and you pay for that. In an ideal situation, you have this combination between a carbon cap and a carbon tax. And the third question was, about the guidelines for applying. These were the first part of my presentation. So you start basically by looking at these kind of IPCC guidelines. You can go further and further to the corporate level, etc. A lot of organizations have created guidelines on that. Probably most relevant for Indonesia at that time is basically looking at the IPCC guidelines, in particular at this kind of amendment, which was done in 2019, which focuses particularly on the traffic sector. Whether you would like then actually voluntarily or through government instruction go to the, let's say, application of guidelines at the city level or at the corporate level for bus companies, etc. That's another question. But I think you might want to start really first with these kind of overall guidelines by IPCC.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Henry, for your response. Yeah, maybe over to Prof. Oliver, if you may add something.
Oops, sorry.
Sorry, I always need to request the unmute. That might take a moment longer. So yeah, Henry talked about the carbon pricing side of things. So the critical element then also for other pricing mechanisms is the differentiation of the pricing, right? And here it comes in very handy to bring together the local and national financing mechanisms that we have at hand, right? So we talked about the differentiated vehicle taxation. So this discourages the purchase of inefficient large vehicles, and similarly at the city level, for example, then road user charging for entering the city, for example, the pricing that you can generate there discourages the use of the car. And then if we do this very transparently and reinvest into public transport here, then we balance out the cost to society and to the individual, and encourage the use of more efficient modes of transportation and vehicles. And that is sort of maybe then the complementary element of non-carbon finance that you can bring in here also from a local government, because usually local governments don't have the direct access to carbon pricing mechanisms.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Oliverla, for the addition. So maybe we have also one additional question here. How can the government and also private sector convince business actors for the carbonization investment are worthwhile? So more on the financing to give the assurance to the government and also private sector.
Great. So maybe then on can start on the private sector side of things. So that's what I also mentioned with this opportunity on electrifying vehicle fleets in all market segments. This is where there's an opportunity to basically build a local industry. For example, in the 2- and 3-wheeler field, we see this in many countries where local startups and small and medium-sized enterprises are now venturing into this field, which in the traditional internal combustion engine field, the market was basically very set with traditional economic powers being active in this field. And also now more companies are heading towards the vans and minibuses and bus segment. Here, of course, competition becomes a little bit more fierce, but here it is not necessarily purely subsidies that are relevant, but having an environment that makes it possible to bring in those vehicles. And that basically is also about allowing those vehicles to be registered and being allowed on the street, basically. That is more an enabling environment than purely focusing on subsidies. We tend to be rather cautious with advising on subsidies for private vehicles, in particular for countries like Indonesia, because basically whoever can afford a car is already quite wealthy. It creates an even more imbalance between, on the social side of things, on to where we put in our priorities investment-wise for our taxpayer funds, let's say. So the priorities should always be on investments into public transport, walking and cycling infrastructure, because these are the socially just modes of transportation, and subsidizing private cars, electric private cars, can be an initial spark, let's say, in the market, but should be taken very cautious as let's say, if you still have money left over in the public purse, then that might be a thing to do, but not something that we would advise doing as a first measure.
Thank you. Mr. Henry, do you want to add something?
Yeah, probably, to give an example. which relates actually to what Oliver said. Right now you're not allowed to register fuel-driven motorbikes anymore in a number of African countries. So they have to be electric. But at the same time, you have also created a kind of market for what Oliver also said, for small motorbikes or small transport vehicles, these tricycles, etc., which are locally manufactured. Even in smaller countries of Africa, this is booming right now. And that's an interesting element. What I'm always thinking, it needs a kind of mixture between financial incentives, a mixture of financing, it needs governmental regulations, and it needs also the sensitivity of the local population. The sensitivity of the local population sometimes is nothing more than a result of noticing massive air pollution, which is also happening in a number of countries. So the discussion when you talk about the discussion in Indonesia, should probably be between various elements of the government. It cannot just one ministry to administer that, but basically agree on a kind of subset of subsidies for population which cannot afford properly a new car, etc. It's administration of mass transport systems, etc. The important thing is to get this kind of combination right, and that is probably a discussion which goes beyond the group which we have right now. That's something which comes to my mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Henry, and also Mr. Prof. Oliver. I guess we don't have any additional question. So we are coming to our end session of this webinar session and also knowledge sharing. I would like to express our appreciation to our valuable speaker today, Prof. Oliver Dieterlah and also Mr. Henry, that for their detail and also rich explanation and also insight, including global benchmark to other country, to also give us more knowledge in advance on the transport decarbonization in terms of finance and also pathway policy here in Indonesia. So I think this comes to the end for their participant that would like to have the e-certificate and also the access to the presentation. You can scan this barcode on your screen. So, and then the committee will send the e-certificate as well as for the presentation that presented by our speaker today. We will project this QR code for a minute. However, me as the moderator say also thank you for your participation today. Once again for our speaker, Professor Oliver Lah and also Mr. Henry. Thank you also for the CMRD colleagues, KfW, and also all dedicated participants joining us from the start 1:30 until now. It is 3:45, near to 4 p.m. Forest Ministry also, and also the universities that also join. I think no additional point from me, and I said thank you and also good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Good.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.